Hello and welcome to this Canadian Global Affairs Institute webinar on the U.S. election that we are recording on October the 15th. I'm your host, Colin Robertson. It's 3 weeks until November the 5th, but voters have already cast ballots in many states. Like so much else in this election, even advance voting that we take for granted in Canada is controversial. It has been a tumultuous campaign. As 81-year-old Joe Biden learned to his chagrin, debates matter. And weeks after his June debate with 78-year-old Donald Trump, he stepped aside in favor of 59-year-old Vice President Kamala Harris, who quickly secured party support, picking 60-year-old Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. Their Chicago convention formally embraced the Democratic team, avoiding the ghosts of 1968 while propelling them back into contention. Donald Trump, meanwhile, survived an assassination attempt at a Pennsylvania campaign rally and enjoyed his own convention, picking 40-year-old Ohio Senator J.D. Vance as his running mate. Pundits say the election race is too close to call. This also holds true for which party will hold the majority in the 435-member House of Representatives, where the Republicans currently hold a slim margin, and the 100-member Senate, where the Democrats hold an equally narrow margin. With 33 Senates up for election, the Democrats defend 23 and the Republicans 10. Then there are the thousands of state, county, and local elections, including 11 governors, as well as ballot initiatives on issues like abortion and gun control. The campaign is held against a backdrop of anxiety over the economy, especially the cost of living. There is disillusionment about the direction of the country. Internationally, there is growing concern about China. Then there are the wars in Ukraine and the Gaza conflict that has extended into Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran. And then there is Sudan, Venezuela, Haiti, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. It's a messy and meaner world. We'll talk about what this all means for Canada, keeping in mind that the United States is our biggest trading partner, our principal ally, and we share responsibility for managing our environment and climate. To help situate the issues and attitudes of Americans, I am delighted to welcome back our presenter, Bruce Stokes, and our commentators, Louise Blais, Gary Doer, and David MacNaughton. Welcome back, Bruce, Louise, Gary, and David. Bruce is the Senior Visiting Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, Associate Fellow at Chatham House, and member of the Council on Foreign Relations. We have all benefited from previous presentations by Bruce. Louise is a career Foreign Service officer who served as our Consul General to Atlanta and as Ambassador to the United Nations. And I'll give a plug for Red Passport that she does with my former colleagues, Jeremy Kinsman and Peter Donalo. Gary and David both served as Canada's ambassador to the United States. Gary through much of the Obama administration and David through the end of Obama and then the Trump years. Gary also served as Manitoba Premier for a decade. Both Gary and David served on the CJAI Advisory Council. To begin, Bruce will present the slides for the first 20 or so minutes. Then Louise, David, and Gary will comment on the presentation and what it means for Canada. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then our presenter, our producer, Joe Calnan, will pose your questions. So please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Joe will accumulate them and then pose the questions to our panel. That's it for me. Bruce, over to you.
Thank you so much, Colin, for inviting me, and thank our commentators. I look forward to learning more from them than I could ever learn from, or you could ever learn from what I'm about to present. I hearty thank you to all the people who are online listening and watching. We appreciate your interest in our election. I always believe that American elections are ultimately unfair, especially to Canadians. We get to vote and you have to live with the consequences. And basically, there's something inherently unfair about that, but it is the way things are. So let me start with some of the data that we have. See if I can get this up. Okay. Yeah, here we go. the things never seem to work the way we expect them to. There we go. Maybe this will do. Yeah. So what are the voters' concerns? Um, for many years, pollsters in America have believed that right direction, wrong direction data from polls indicate what may happen in an election. And in a number of elections, it has led to a kind of foretelling of a shift in administrations. We have a record high percentage of people who think the nation is on the wrong track. That should be pretty ominous for Vice President Harris. But we should remind ourselves that people have felt that way for 28 of the last 36 years, and that hasn't always led to a change in administrations. But this is not a good sign for the Harris campaign. When you ask people what they're most concerned about, Republicans and Democrats are concerned about different things. Republicans are much more concerned about the economy and immigration. Democrats are more concerned about democracy and the Supreme Court, to a lesser extent, abortion. So this is an election about different issues. There is a divide among voters with a majority, and I find this personally quite disturbing, that a majority of Americans believe in mass deportation of undocumented people, and in majority really, a majority of people believe that the federal government should restore abortion access. So again, there's a huge division over immigration, with frankly, a surprisingly large number of Democrats actually also supporting mass deportation. There's polarization over priorities besides the economy and immigration. As you can see in this Pew survey, while many of you who are listening in might be aware of the fact or think you believe or understand that the United States is deeply polarized, I dare say if you look at these different priorities of voters, the polarization is quite stark. And 51 percentage points on climate, 43 points on immigration, 32 points on abortion. And the only priority on this list where there's somewhat agreement is over gun policy. There's not a disagreement about it being a priority issue. But I dare say, if you dug into this, Republicans and Democrats mean different things about the priority of gun policy. Republicans are more likely to say, I want to defend my right to have a gun. And Democrats are much more likely to say, we need some rules to control the kinds of guns that people can have. So even there's a huge polarization. We all, I think, are aware of James Carville's famous expression back in 1992, it's the economy stupid. I actually think this election suggests, no, it's culture stupid. Cultural polarization is quite striking. 71 points on guns, 56 points on the legacy of slavery for Black people, 53 points on sexual identity. We have different cultural views that are manifesting themselves in this election, and driving voters to different conclusions about who to vote for. Among many of these polling results, to me, this is one of the more disturbing ones because it goes right to the question of American democracy. This question is, do we need a strong president who should be allowed to rule without too much interference from the courts and Congress? And nearly half of Republicans say yes, and a quarter of Democrats agree with that premise. Now, this is about as close as you get to authoritarian government as I can imagine. And there seems to be um, strong support. A third of the population in total believe that's where we need to go. And I think it is frankly an indictment about American democracy. It is a frustration people have with the functioning of the democracy, the inability to get for Congress to get stuff done, the courts being woefully out of touch with public opinion. And as a result, you see people wanting a strong leader. And this survey question by the Pew Research Center, I think, gets at the heart of that. What do people mean by a strong leader? Both a majority of both Republicans and Democrats say more governance by executive order. Bear in mind, this is something that is increasingly being done in the United States from president to president. When you're frustrated with what the Congress can't accomplish, the president issues an executive order to make it happen. The problem with that is, of course, that on day one of his successor or her successor, they can change everything. So for business, that is a very unstable situation because you can flip flop back and forth on regulation. Um, Notice that beyond executive orders, though, it is really Trump supporters who are much more supportive of ordering law enforcement officials to investigate your opponents or firing government officials, which is one of the things that Donald Trump has promised to do, or pardoning your friends if they've been convicted of a crime. International concerns, not a priority for Americans. Historically, if you ask people about their priorities in an election year or any year, foreign policy concerns are generally at very down low on the list, although we are in a very uncertain world right now. And so I do think it does play into voters' concerns, not so much because they know much about the individual issue. Bear in mind that only 20% of Americans could find Ukraine on a map when the Ukraine war started, but rather that people see the world, or some people at least see the world in chaos, and they want a strong figure to try to set that back in order. I always like to joke that, at the end of the day, voters want daddy to fix the problem, and the president's the daddy. And if this daddy can't fix the problem, maybe we'll get another daddy and see if he can fix it. 8 in 10 Harris supporters back compromise with allies. Only 4 in 10 Trump supporters agree. This is a real division over what it means to have allies and whether they follow orders or whether you try to work with them on a variety of issues. 3 times as many Republicans as Democrats back decreasing or ending U.S. NATO commitments. Now, bear in mind, a plurality or a majority of Republicans and Democrats support keeping the commitment for what it is now. I dare say they don't know what the commitment is, but keeping on the way we are has the greatest support among American voters. It's just that you have a number of Republicans, a quarter of Republicans really, who want to decrease support, which, as we know, is something that Donald Trump has threatened to do in the past. It took 6 months for the U.S. Congress to pass a Ukraine aid bill this year. And we have a growing percentage of Republicans in the Congress who say we're now giving Ukraine too much. I think that we have to assume that next year, whoever is president, whoever controls the Congress, it may well be harder to get aid out of the Congress for Ukraine. There is support in this Institute for Global Affairs survey of a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. People have different reasons why they favor a negotiated settlement. It's not one clear reason, but I do think it is a sign of war weariness among American voters, and that will weigh heavily on the president's position, whoever that person may be, next year. The Gaza war has now passed its first anniversary. Israel is now back into Lebanon again. But what's interesting is that in the last few months, there's been a rebound in America's support for Israel. As you can note, after October 7th of last year, support fell as the attack on Gaza by the Israelis increased in severity, but we've seen a rebound recently. I can't explain that to you, um, but it may have something to do with the fact that the American public wants to be with the winner, and it may look like Israel is prevailing, and so they want to associate themselves with that attitude by Israel, that position by Israel. Um, what is also interesting is that in Gallup surveys and Pew surveys, when you break down support for Israelis or Palestinians um, by age group, that even before the Gaza war, before the horrible incident of October the 7th and the massacre, and for years before that, the support among young Americans for Israel has been declining. And I have said to Israeli officials, even before the Gaza war, uh, you realize this is the next generation of American leaders, and you're losing them. But that hasn't seemed to deter Israel's position on various issues that offend those young people. Um, Americans' attitudes towards China have never been worse. 8 in 10 people disapprove of or have an unfavorable view of China. This is worse than has been even after Tiananmen Square. And I dare say, if you look at these numbers and you're an American politician, um, anything negative you can say about China or any policy against China that you can advocate will be widely supported. So it's almost as if there's no limits on what anti-China policies or attitudes could be. Um, Americans have long believed that trade was good for the country, but not good for them. In this Cato Institute survey recently, they found what we at Pew found 3 different times. Americans don't believe trade creates jobs. They don't believe it raises wages. They don't even believe it lowers prices. And bear in mind that economists tell you nations should trade because it will lower prices. Now, I dare say in those Pew surveys, the Canadians didn't believe that trade lowered prices either. In fact, in 40 countries, we only found that the Israelis and the Swedes believed that trade lowered prices. But at any rate, there's not a whole lot of support for trade in the United States. And with the um, relook at the Canada, Mexico, US deal in a couple of years, we should bear this in mind. The horse race, which is really what we all care about, who's going to win. Nationally, Harris leads within the margin of error, although other polls have shown Trump might be in the lead. But in this New York Times survey that just came out, she's ahead by 3 points nationally. In the CBS poll that just came out, she's ahead by 3 points again. But in battleground states, the states that really matter, she's only ahead by 2 points. Again, these are both within the margin of error. Pew has broken this down by who supports Harris and Trump. As you can see, uh, uh, men are more likely to support Trump than are women. Young people are more likely to support Harris than older people. And people who have a postgraduate education are much more likely to support Harris than people who have only a high school education or less. This last 3 weeks of the campaign is really focusing on this 13% of the electorate. This survey suggests that there's only about 13% of the registered voters who are persuadable. In other words, they haven't made up their mind yet. We don't know why they haven't made up their mind. Maybe they haven't been paying attention. Maybe they really are agonizing, but the fight really is over that getting those persuadable voters to go my way rather than the other way. Um, Two narratives in the press on polling and who's going to vote for whom. One is that Harris is not doing as well among blacks as one might have expected, given the fact that she is half African American. As you can see, uh, uh, the presidential support among Black voters has decreased between 2016 and 2024. Obviously, 2024 is not the estimate of the vote, but actually the polling estimates. And the support for a Republican candidate has doubled among Blacks. Uh, Similarly, among Hispanics, there has been a bit of an ebbing of support for the Democratic candidate. Um, I do think it's significant to point out, though, that 28% of Hispanics voted for Trump in 2016. 36% supported him in 2020. That was a jump of 8 percentage points. It's only 37% who say they'll vote for him this time. There's been a lot of press coverage recently about Harris losing Hispanic votes. Frankly, is not much difference between the erosion that Biden experienced at this point, at least. But there is some gender difference where Hispanic women and Hispanic men differ. Um, Overall, pessimists prefer Trump, optimists prefer Harris. Bear in mind that when Harris came out of the gates after Joe Biden stepped back, uh, her message was really one of hope about the future, looking forward. And that did appeal to the optimists in the American voting public. Um, the gap on who you trust or who you think will do best for the economy has narrowed. People still think Trump is more likely to be a better candidate to handle the economy. Do bear in mind there are a lot of low information voters out there. A majority of Republicans believe we are in recession. We haven't been in recession since 2020. A significant portion of the public believes that the stock market has gone down under Joe Biden. It has actually gone up dramatically. It's now at record highs. But for whatever reason, why they believe this, people believe that Trump will do a better job on the economy and inflation, whereas Harris is seen as looking out for the middle class. 3 and 4 voters don't believe Trump will accept the outcome of this election if he loses. Watch this space. We'll see if he does. But it's interesting that people are already very worried about that. As those of you who follow our election know, we have this cockamamie system. The popular vote doesn't matter. It's who wins in specific states because of the electoral college that's in our Constitution. We can get into in the discussion why we have an electoral college. But as you can see, it really gets down to 6 or 7 states. And when you look at that map, I think the thing to remember is it's Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania. If she wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she wins, basically. If she wins Michigan and Wisconsin, but loses Pennsylvania, she can't make it up by winning Arizona and Nevada. She would have to win either North Carolina or Georgia, which is a much heavier lift. Finally, after a presentation on polling, I have to admit polls in America are notoriously wrong. If you go back to the 1956 Dwight Eisenhower presidential race when he was running for re-election, the national polls have overestimated the Democratic vote pretty consistently. There's been 6 times when they overestimated the Republican vote. All the other times since 1956, they've overestimated the Democratic vote. So when national polls say she is ahead by 2 or 3 percentage points, that may well not be enough. to overcome weaknesses she may have in some of these key electoral states. Because, at least that's what the history of polling would suggest. Finally, as you probably know, we elect a third of the 100-seat U.S. Senate, the upper house, every 2 years. We elect all of the 435 members of the House of Representatives, the lower house. For whatever reason, Americans seem to like divided government. In the last 6 cycles of every 2 years having an election, we've only generated through our votes a united government where a single party controlled the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. We've only created a united government twice in those 6 elections. And bear in mind, that's meaningful. Donald Trump had a united government in the first 2 years of his electorate, and he was able to cut taxes for the rich. Joe Biden had a unified government the first 2 years of his presidency, and he was able to pass the CHIPS Act and the infrastructure bill and the information and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. So you can get stuff done in a unified government. It's very difficult to get things done in a divided government. But bear in mind, only for 2 times in the last 6 elections, it's actually in the last 13 elections, we have elected a divided government 10 times. So Americans seem to prefer divided government, in part, I think, because they don't like government. Or as my father used to say, who hated politicians, maybe you just have to throw the bums out and get new bums. With that, I'll leave this to our commentary. Thank you.
Bruce, thank you so much. As always, compelling, insightful, but sobering, especially when they think of the implications for Canada when it comes to things like trade, the border, and our mutual security pacts. But let me turn to our distinguished panel, and Louise, I'll let you lead on this one. What did you take away from Bruce's presentation, and what worries you the most from what you heard from Bruce?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Colin. Look, I think it was a fantastic presentation. I think it gives us a real sense of where America is today. And clearly, we talk about how America is divided, but I think what Bruce represented is there are 2 Americas, really, cohabitating in the same country, but different values, different beliefs. There are really essentially 2 Americas. And I don't think that's going to change. This election notwithstanding, I think it's sort of baked in now. It has been for a while. It's maybe getting slightly worse, but this is the way, and for us, for Canada to engage with 2 Americas is a challenge, obviously, because we need to find a way to appeal to both, but with different arguments, because what will work with one side won't work with the other. So we're constantly straddling this reality as Canadians, as we engage in the US, as Gary and David know full well. So I think this is what I really take out of your presentation. The other thing that struck me was pessimists vote for Trump, optimists vote for Harris. I mean, it's a big generalization, but I think pessimism and negativism, nostalgia is a strong motivator. And I think that's what we're seeing. And I think that's why his support is staying fairly strong, notwithstanding what many people are commenting is him running a not so great campaign. I had a Republican friend of mine, an elected official still in Congress today, obviously I won't name him, who said it was his to lose, and he's doing a really good job of losing it. So there's a little bit of frustration, I think, inside the Republican Party as a result of that. But nonetheless, the support is fairly strong. And I'll perhaps end my first sortie here to say that we've seen this weekend has been very interesting. This past few days, we've seen President Obama come out and really targeting African, Black American African men for getting them to vote for Harris. And so it's very interesting. I think a lot of us, and I think this is what your polling shows. Yes, you can draw certain generalities and trends, but it's complicated. You have Latinos voting for Trump. You have Black men and women, I would say, voting for him. I mean, it's not something that's easy to decipher, and I think it complicates the campaign for Harris. Makes it difficult for her to appeal to it's a little nebulous as to where the support still is or still to be found for her. And I take your point, I'll end with that it's really Pennsylvania that is likely the focus. And there, you wonder whether she might regret not picking Shapiro as her running mate. We'll wait and see. Obviously, it's very close and it could go either way. But thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Louise. As you say, complicated. And just to remind our audience, use the Q&A function to pose your questions that Joe will accumulate and ask shortly. Gary, let me turn to you about your takeaways from what Bruce has just told us. Gary, I think you're on mute.
Excellent presentation, Bruce, again, and very thorough and detailed and worrisome, I would say, about the polling results. I think your comment about the lead really about the polarization is quite stark as it comes through in question after answer after answer in your data and your data. I think obviously Louise mentioned Pennsylvania. I'm one of these people that believe if you can put 19 electoral votes in your pocket or your purse with Shapiro, you might want to think about that a lot more. That is a very important decision she made. Obviously, Minnesota is close to Manitoba, so I'm biased about the vice president. But Pennsylvania is so important. It's a bit of a risk of her not to choose Shapiro. We'll see that at the end of the day, one way or the other. It really is somewhat fascinating to look at the Republican Party itself, the culture and positioning, particularly on international issues. We've come a long way from Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall, to the present Republican candidate for president getting, with Bob Woodward's book, getting outed on supplying COVID tests and asking them not to make it public. It seems like a long gap in terms of American opinion and American politics. But I do believe that there's still a huge ability, if harnessed, to have Republicans concerned about the threat of Putin and the worry about Ukraine, rather than what the polling results show today on Russia as a threat. For Canada, it's obviously NATO is a very interesting answer. I think many of us domestically are arguing for us to meet our target of 2% within our own country, notwithstanding this election. Just that this is what we signed on to long before the election, and this is what we should be implementing in our own domestic economic and military policies in our own country. But if there's another reminder we need, this poll also illustrates that very clearly. But the polls are very fascinating. I happen to believe, notwithstanding the polling on divided government, I believe that the Senate will go Republican. I think the House will narrowly go Democrat. I think that people looking at trade agreements should understand that any amendment of a trade agreement has got to go to the House and the Senate. So there is a bit of a buffer there. In terms of what it means for Canada on the economic side, I would want to, I think the governors and the premiers should get together more often. Governors run the states, the economy of the states a lot more than the Senate does. And there's a governor's meeting early in 2025 in Washington, and I think the Canadian premiers, I think Premier Ford is chairing the premiers group. They should try to encounter their counterparts, governors, in and around February of 2025 at that governor's meeting to carry forward the fact that we are United States' best customers and they are our best customers, and that's very, very important for the North American neighborhood.
Well, thanks, Gary. We consistently have to drive home the fact that our trading relationship is mutually beneficial. David, let me turn to you and your takeaways from Bruce's presentation.
Well, I guess there are really two. One of them is, a deep concern about, the post-U.S. election circumstances. That number of, more than or a third of Americans saying that the president should be able to do whatever without any constraints from the courts or Congress is worrisome. I really do worry about a very, very close election and Trump basically saying he doesn't accept it and and I think you're quite right, Bruce. I think the violence would take place outside of DC this time, and that's even more worrisome. So from a Canadian, looking at the United States, our next door neighbor, our best friend, everything, worried about the state of democracy and, the society generally and the divisions that take place. On the trade front, I think there's an awful lot of people in Canada that sort of say, well, it'll be okay from a trade point of view if Harris gets in. The real worrisome thing is if Trump gets in. I think that underestimates the ideological opposition to trade in the Democratic Party, the isolationism and protectionism that has reasserted itself in the United States on both sides. And I think we're a bit naive in terms of assuming that just because we do happen to be the largest trading partner for the United States, that somehow or other we're gonna be able to skate through 2026 or even executive action like Section 232. We just passed this legislation in Canada, Bill C-282, that restricts our trade negotiators' ability to increase access to, agriculture in the country. I mean, I think we're a bit naive at the present moment. I don't think that the government is naive. I think they understand some of the pressures that are going to come on us, but I think the general public, is not as aware of the challenges that we face. And it's not just on trade, it's on border, it's on fentanyl, it's on, meeting 2%. It's, protecting, it's what are we going to do? What's our position going to be on China? And then, of course, you've got, the attitudes of the Trump people about Mexico and the potential of that really becoming a huge issue if Trump is reelected. So it's going to be turmoil one way or the other, and I think it's going to be on the general society level, which is worrisome for everyone. And in terms of trade, notwithstanding all of the things that we've been talking about for 4 decades about diversifying our trade, we still depend on 75% or something like that of our exports go to the United States of America. So it's going to be a bit of a rough ride, I suspect, regardless of what the outcome is.
Well, very much so. Thanks, David. It's still the United States and all the rest. Bruce, I want to come back to you. You've been devoting a lot of time recently to the transatlantic relationship throughout your career. And nobody doubts Joe Biden's commitment to NATO or his active internationalism. And I think Kamala Harris promises to continue this approach. But as you point out in your slides, you can't say the same for Republicans and certainly not for Donald Trump. My question to you is, last time his instincts around NATO and some of Ukrainian things seem to have been squelched by the adults in his administration, but I'm not sure we can count on either the administration or Congress next time. So my question is, regardless of who wins, what does the US expect from the allies, and what should Canada be doing?
Great question. And I think you're right. I think we have to assume, unless proven otherwise, that the one salient lesson that Donald Trump learned from his first 4 years in office was don't surround yourself with adults. Surround yourself with yes men from day one. Because most of those adults who were around him in the first term have now come out for Harris because they've experienced Donald Trump. In terms of what the allies can expect and what Canada can expect, I would expect from Donald Trump growing pressure on Canada to spend more on defense. What is it? I think it's 23 of the 32 NATO countries now spend at least 2% on defense. I'm waiting for Donald Trump to follow the lead of the president of Poland, who wrote a piece in the Washington Post a couple of months ago saying, well, we spend 3.5%. Everybody should spend 3.5%. And the US spends 3.5%. And I'm actually shocked that Donald Trump hasn't picked up on this yet. He is a guy who always wants more. And I think that so the pressure on the allies to spend more on defense will be there. I think that, Europe spends about 80% of its military technology budget in the United States. And we're asking Europe to spend more on defense, and they are spending more. They will spend more on defense. And I will bet you any money that even a Harris administration will echo the American military suppliers' arguments and say 80% of a bigger number sounds like a good number to us. Why should it go down as a percentage? And I think that's going to be one of the challenges we face no matter who is president. One issue that I think we have to remind ourselves is that, as you mentioned, Joe Biden was deeply committed to the NATO relationship. Joe Biden probably spent more time as a politician and as elected leader in Europe than probably any of our presidents since Dwight Eisenhower when he was the commander of the World War II forces. But Joe Biden formed his worldview at a time when if you were an American and you thought about the world, you thought about it through Europe. Harris is 20 years younger. She grew up on the West Coast. She grew up at a time when Japan and then China were the challenges of the future. I don't think we can ever expect to have an American president who is as Euro-focused as Joe Biden has been. And that's just a fact of life. We can't change that. It doesn't mean that Harris doesn't like Europe or doesn't like our other allies. It's just that she formed her worldview at a different era. And that has consequences.
Oh, very much so. Well, thanks, Bruce. David, I'd like you to lead on this one. In 2020, Prime Minister Trudeau was one of the first to congratulate Joe Biden on his victory, and we were quickly out to reach out to the transition team despite the pandemic. And as we all know, I think it was by the end of February, we had that virtual summit, which led to the roadmap, which has become the framework for the last 4 years. My question to you is, in his call to President, whoever that should be, what should Mr. Trudeau stress as his priorities this time around?
Well, I think the important thing is to understand what the priorities of the new president are. I think what we tend to do too much is to, address the issues that are most important to us. And I think we've got to try to make sure that in terms of an outreach, whether it is to Harris or to Trump, that we're talking about the issues that they are, he or she is most concerned about. How are we going to help you as your next door neighbor and your best friend overcome some of these challenges? And whether that be illegal migration or defense spending or whatever it is, the discussion shouldn't be the first thing out of our mouths is, hey, we're your best trading partner. Let's talk about why don't we get together and have a solution to softwood lumber? I mean, let's be sensitive to their needs first and foremost, and the rest of it can come, secondarily as opposed to in the first instance.
Oh, I think that makes a lot of sense. Gary, what advice would you be giving to Mr. Trudeau in terms of raising the issues that matter the most to Canada, but at the same time, as David points out, being sensitive to where the president-elect is coming from?
Well, my advice would be to immediately increase and improve our commitment to NATO and give that as a win to either Harris or Trump. With Trump, if he's reelected as president or elected as president this time around, one thing he seeks and enjoys is a bumper sticker with his name on it as a win. I expect that Harris also, if she won, will want to get some wins on the board with Canada as an ally. And the obvious one is for us to really work on our already signed commitment to NATO and provide that commitment much more in a fulsome, detailed, specific way to the new president, whoever that is. And I agree with David on that point. It's not about us with the new president. It's about getting something that the new president can effectively show the American public how important the relationship is. And it's very important to do that.
Louise, what would you say to Mr. Trudeau? Gary says defense, and David says be sensitive to where the president's coming from. This is all good advice. What would you add to that?
Well, obviously, I agree with that. I mean, what I would add is there are things that we should be doing now before we make a call. And I think some of those things is we're doing some self-harm right now, and that's a bit worrisome to me. I mean, the DST was an example of an area where we're just picking up a fight where we didn't really have one before. And I think you could argue, well, I mean, that'll give us some chips and things that we can negotiate. But really, honestly, lately, we have just been a little bit more of a problem than the solution that David is saying we should be trying to be. So I think we have things to do at home leading up to it. I think the US is not going to solve our GDP problem. Our GDP per capita is really, our productivity is going down. And these are issues that we need to fix. A stronger Canada is better for the United States. And so I think a lot of what we have to do is good policies at home. And then to add exactly what Gary and David has said, look at where we have aligned interest and continue the work of slowly, kindly reminding them that we are in this together, that in a rivalry with China, really Canada is an important ally. And we have to just can't assume they're responsive to these messages. I mean, but they just, sometimes they forget. And so, and sometimes they feel that we always go to them with an ask, well, like something we're not happy about and something we want to fix. I think we have to change the dynamic a little bit, come at it a little bit less transactional. So fix things at home, be more on the listening side, and try to build those shared solutions that will keep us on side with the United States. I mean, we can't change our geography. That's where we are. We have the United States we have today. It's more complicated than it used to be, and our game has to be better.
Oh, good points. Joe, let me turn to you in questions.
Colin,
please,
could I
go ahead.
Add one thing to that? I think we both face a challenge from to an industry that is probably the most deeply integrated between our two economies, and that's the auto industry. And the challenge comes from China. And I think one of the things we need to do next year together is decide, even if we do slightly different defensive things, that we don't do things that contradict each other, that they're in parallel. Because if we end up with significantly different defensive measures against Chinese electric vehicles and batteries, we're going to, in essence, screw up one of the most deeply integrated parts of our two economies. And that would not be in either one of our interests.
Oh, here. That's certainly for Canada. That's vitally important. Joe, let me turn to you in audience questions.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, and thank you, Bruce, of course, for your excellent presentation, and to Louise, Gary, and David for your reflections on what it could mean for Canada. I saw, Gary, that you'd like to say something, but I'll get to you in just a moment here. So I would really recommend that all of the attendees here, please do continue adding your questions to the Q&A portion of the panel. I already see that we have a number of great questions, but I encourage everyone to contribute additional questions, and I'll try to combine them into a few questions for the panelists here. But first up, I'd like to ask a question to all the panelists here, and this combines a few of the questions from Mary Ann Carter and Barry Monroe. And this is the question of whether Canada is ready for USMCA CUSMA discussions in 2026. So unlike in 2018, the Canadian federal government is now relatively much weaker, with internal dissent, the support of the Bloc Québécois required to maintain confidence in government, and low support among Canadians going into an election year in 2025. So a question for the panel is, could the current Canadian government weakness affect trade negotiations or other matters of bilateral importance with the United States?
Okay. Thanks, Joe. Let me pose that to David, because you were critical in handling the Trump file the last time. Are we relatively, we launched last January the Prime Minister outreach under Mary Young and Francois-Philippe Champagne, reaching out, making the case for trade. More recently, our ambassador, Kirsten Hillman, has said that we've added security to that message to the Americans. We've been doing this now for almost a year. How is that going?
Well, I think it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. I think that there's sort of a view among a lot of people that we'll be able to kind of skate through the review of 2026, and we're not going to have to do anything really substantive. I think that's naive. I think if I were, what I would be inclined to do is to really think through pretty clearly what we can put on the table on, multiple areas in terms of our relationship with the United States, and in return for that they would agree to, extend the agreement, another dozen years or whatever. I mean, the problem with the situation at the present moment is even if we can't agree in 2026, then there's this sort of sword hanging over us, because it's got to be reviewed every year or 2 years or whatever it is, and that will just dampen the investment climate. So I would say, okay, let's start thinking right now as to what we're going to put on the table, not just in the context of 2026, but what are we going to put on the table on January 21st, when the new president, takes over, that is a comprehensive thing. And oh, by the way, part of it is actually solidifying our trading relationship with the United States. As I say, I think what we're doing is necessary. I just don't think it's sufficient.
Oh, fair enough. Louise, you mentioned the digital service tax is an unnecessary irritant. We've also got supply management to be entrenched. It's never be raised again. It's a vote away in the Senate from passage. What do you think about supply management, and what else should we be putting on that list that David has talked about?
Well, I mean, I totally agree with David here, and I think he said it very well. I think we're going to have, there's going to have to be give and take here. We're just not going to save every single piece of furniture. I think we have to think long term. We have to think creatively. We're lucky because Canada really does have top notch trade negotiators. It just comes from part and parcel of having been such a great trading nation. We have great people, great minds. I think our government has to give them a little bit of leeway. We have to think about, supply management. I mean, we've always, law or no law, we always, it's like culture. Those are the two things we've always kept. So I'm not particularly worried about that one per se. I'm not thinking this is the place where we'll find a great deal of openness. But I think there are other areas that I think we can achieve that. The last thing I'd want to say, and Gary, I know we'll have some thoughts on this, but unfortunately, what's complicating things right now is Mexico in this situation. Relations between US and Mexico are not where they should be. We're still in this freeze, diplomatic freeze. And just last week, the new president has put the American ambassador and our ambassador on notice that they can only interact with the foreign minister and they cannot speak to any other government officials from other government departments. This is not a good time to be having these kinds of problems. And so I think that worries me a little bit. We can't control our Mexican friends. Canada could have better direct bilateral relations with Mexico than we do. That could help. I think we can't fall back on that, but we're going to have to really watch that space very carefully. So it's not just us. It's also what the Mexicans are going to do.
Well, thanks, Louise. Gary?
Yeah, on the auto industry that Bruce raised and Louise's point and David's point, I strongly believe that Canada was smart on siding with the United States in the first trade dispute with Mexico on energy. I strongly believe that we should be with the United States opposed to China establishing state-owned enterprises that undermine the trade agreement in North America. They've been doing it over the last couple of years. This is going to be a very awkward situation with Mexico, but I do believe that Mexico, by approving all these Chinese state-owned operations, is really undermining the Three Amigos trade agreement that was reached a couple of years ago. And I do believe we should be firm on it. Our auto industry will want that as well, located in Ontario and Quebec. And I think we should, it's not going to be pleasant, but I think we have to be very, very decisive on agreeing with the United States up front on the undermining of the trade agreement with the state-owned enterprises established by China in Mexico.
Okay, good advice. Joe, one more question before we have to start wrapping things up.
Yeah, exactly. One more quick question, just keeping in mind timing, and I'm sure everybody has many other things to do on this day. So another question from a few panelists, including, of course, Brad Robson, and I'm going to paraphrase here, is where we have the question of what we consider to be the best outcome from the U.S. presidential election, but also, of course, congressional and Senate elections. And the best outcome for broad Canadian interests, so including the interests across Canada. So what combination of election outcomes in the United States would the panelists consider to be the best outcome for Canada's interests?
All right, we'll go backwards. Gary, best outcome?
Well, I lean to a Democratic win, so I have a bias, but certainly I don't think, I think that what's going to happen is there's going to be a change in the House to the Democrats and a change in the Senate. The Canadian media treats that as a swap. It's not. The Senate has got way more power than the House. For example, appointing all the cabinet ministers, all the ambassadors, all the military leaders, all the important, the Supreme Court. I think we should understand in Canada that it's not a swap just to change one or the other. I think the US businesses that actually trade with Canada want to have a divided House from time to time, because sometimes gridlock stops unfortunate action in Washington. And so it's not bad having a little bit of gridlock for Canada if somebody is therefore has some balances on their authority. And so it's not a bad thing for the House to change to the Democrats.
Okay, David, best outcome?
Well, I think the best outcome is a decisive outcome one way or the other. I'm not gonna pick who I would prefer or who I wouldn't prefer. I just hope it's decisive. And I hope that the House and the Senate are split, because at least that provides some kind of check and balance, which is important in the U.S. system. But yeah, I think as long as the American people decide one way or the other decisively, we can deal with either one of them effectively.
Louise, best outcome?
Nothing to add. I totally agree.
Okay. Well, my final question, and I'm going to let Bruce lead on this one. What are you reading or streaming these days? Bruce.
My wife and I are increasingly devoted to PBS mysteries that usually come from Great Britain or Scandinavia. So I'm amazed in my dotage that I find the kind of narrative of a mystery, where there's a crime and then there's an investigation and there's a conclusion before you go to bed, that's the best way to go.
Wonderful diversion. Perfect. Louise, what are you reading or streaming these days?
I'm reading Lloyd Axworthy's memoirs this week. He'll be coming on our podcast, The Red Passport. Here's another plug, and shameless as it was. And so reading his memoirs, and they're really fascinating. Obviously, it's not just about his foreign policy days when he was cabinet minister, but really his entire political career. And it's very, very interesting, and I recommend it.
Okay. It's Lloyd Axworthy, A Political Life. Gary, Lloyd Axworthy, of course, is hometown boy.
Good old Winnipegger is in the front page of the Free Press today. I'm just started to read The Situation Room by George Stephanopoulos. I did have the privilege one time of Dennis McDonough, the chief of staff for President Obama. We had a meeting down there because there was no other conference rooms available in the basement of the White House on an important Canada-U.S. issue. But of course, that iconic picture of the Obama administration during the mission to take out Osama bin Laden is an iconic picture in the book, and I wanted to read it. And it goes back to the Bay of Pigs with John F. Kennedy. Interesting book.
Okay, The Situation Room. David, what are you reading or streaming these days?
Well, I'm, one of the great things of, being in Washington for the years I was there is I got to develop some new friendships and who have lasted since I've come back. And one of them is H.R. McMaster, and I'm reading At War with Ourselves, written by H.R. about his tour of duty in the White House. So it's fascinating.
All right, At War with Ourselves, H.R. McMaster. Thank you, David. Thank you all. I hope you've all enjoyed and benefited from this CJAI webinar. We were joined today by Bruce Stokes, Louise Blais, Gary Doer, and David MacNaughton. You will find Bruce's presentation on the CJAI website. We'll be broadcasting this session as a future Global Exchange podcast. I'd also like to thank CJAI's strategic partners, Lockheed Martin Canada, General Dynamics, Irving Shipbuilding, Hanwha Defense, and Synovus Energy for their deep and long-standing support for the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. This webinar was brought to you by our team at CJAI, and my thanks go out to our producer, Joe Calnan. I'm Colin Robertson. Thanks for joining us today.